Welcome back. We are working on our slider web interaction component. In the previous lesson, we implemented the previous and next buttons, and that is working really well. We're going to spend a quick minute in this lesson doing a little bit of styling, adding a little bit of aesthetic interest to the navigation buttons that we have created, and then we will go ahead and do a couple of other tweaks to our slider to make sure that's going to work great and look great no matter what type of content you might be using it on. So first of all, I want to replace the previous and next labels with an icon. So we're going to once again implement Font Awesome. I'm going to copy the free CSS link here. We're going to paste that into the top of our HTML file like so. And then we're going to do a search for the angle icons, which I use quite a bit for navigation arrows, like you can see here. So let's pick angle left. We'll copy that HTML. For the angle left, we will come down into our data slider buttons here. And then for each of these, let's drop these to a second line. And then we will add span.sr only around the previous and next labels so that it'll still be read by a screen reader. And we can even actually, let's put next, previous slide, and next slide in there to make that a little bit more clear. And let me tab over here, and then we will paste in angle left, and for the next we'll have angle right. And so I also want to make sure that these are aria hidden equals true. I want to make sure screen readers don't try to read our icon out. And now that we have that in place, you'll see we have nice little icons for each of those buttons, which is looking good. And let's do a little bit of Sass work to kind of style this up. So we have a div with a class of slider nav. Our button has a class of slider previous and slider next. So let's kind of style those. First of all, I want to make sure they're on top of the slider container itself. So I want to make sure that is positioned relative. And then that way we can add slider navigation. We'll have our dot slider nav, which will be position absolute. Top is going to be 50%, left will be 0, right will be 0. So that'll kind of be positioned over the top of the image, as you can see there. And actually, let's change this to be, just because I don't want a layer over top of our slider, because later on we're going to introduce some touch events. So I don't want that blue box there actually covering up our slides. I want to make sure when we do our touch events, you can actually, you'll notice here if I drag left and right, I can't drag the image. But if I drag up here, I pick up the image. And that's because my click target right here is the slider nav itself. So I'm actually going to change this because I want to avoid that to, what do we call those two buttons? Slider prev, slider next. Slider previous, slider next. And then we'll take out the left and the right, but we'll still do position absolute, top 50%. And then for dot slider previous, we'll set the left to 15 pixels. And for slider next, we'll set the right to 15 pixels. Like so. So we kind of get these buttons on either side. And then let's do a little bit of styling for the buttons themselves. First of all, I want to kind of set a fixed size. So let's set a width of maybe 50 pixels, height of 50 pixels, line height of 50 pixels to make sure the icons are that tall. We'll reduce the padding down to 0 in case there's any padding and set text align to center. Let's sort all these guys. So it didn't actually, it looked like it was pretty close to 50 already, but it is actually exactly 50 by 50. And then that way I can also add margin top negative 25 pixels. And that way it'll be completely centered because the top is at 50%, but then we're bringing it back up by half of its height. Let's also take away the box shadow. So we'll set none. And then we will set border radius to 50%. So it's a nice circle icon. You can see there. Let's set the background color to transparentize darker 0.5 or something like that. So we kind of have it just overlays the image, but you can still see the image behind it. And the hover style, I want to kind of override that because it becomes fully opaque. So let's make sure that when you hover or focus on each of those buttons, We'll set the background color to transparentize darker. And then we'll do the amount by only 0.25. So it'll become a little more opaque, but not fully opaque. You can see that hover style. I'm gonna hover each one of those. And then let's up the font size here to, I don't know, 24 pixels. Make the icons a little bit bigger. I think that looks pretty good. So we have some left and right navigation arrows. That's looking really nice. That's what I would more typically expect from a slider, is to kind of have the arrows actually on top of the images. And now you can very easily pan back and forth with those. So another thing I want to make sure that we do is we have a method in our slider.js to update the width of our slides. Because if you recall, in our CSS file, we kind of hard-coded this width of 300%, which is if this is set incorrectly, so let's just say you change the number of slides or something, it's going to totally mess up our presentation. So we are really dependent on making sure that this width value is set correctly. And I don't necessarily want to rely on doing this inside of our CSS file. So you can see here the width is set to 300%. Let's take that out because I don't think that's going to be a good place to do that. Obviously, you wouldn't want to have to update your CSS every time you want to change the number of slides. It should be dynamic. It should automatically update. So what we're going to do to fix that is inside of our JavaScript file, we're going to create a new method in here. We can call it something like set slider width or set width, something like that. And then we'll basically be able to call that method anytime the number of slides changes, but it'll also call it automatically when you initialize this component. And essentially it's going to count the number of slides. And then whenever it counts that, it's going to set the width on that container. So that should be fairly easy to do. What we'll do is we'll go all the way. Well, I want to do it above the listeners. I normally like to try to keep my listeners at the bottom and then regular methods above that. So maybe right below get slide index. We will add a new set slider width method. And what that'll do is it'll take this.state.slider.style.width. So it's going to set a width style, just like we're using the style.left property in other methods, equal to, and then it'll basically just build a template string, which is going to be this.state.slider.child_element_count times 100. Whoops, I want to make sure that times 100 is inside the template string, and then we'll add % on that. So if you have one item, it's going to equal 100%. If you have two items, 200%, etc. That's a pretty simple method. We'll add some documentation here. Set width of slider based on child count. Return void. Like so. So now that we have this method, what we can do is we'll call this method, first of all, on init up here. So whenever we initialize, we will set slider width. And what that'll do is it will document.query selector all. So we're going to select all the instances of data slider. So this .config.attr data slider. And then for each of those sliders, let's first of all load state. So this .load state slider. And then let's this.set width, set slider width, which will take the current state and it'll set the width. And you know what? Now that I'm thinking of this, I actually probably want the set slider width to accept a parameter rather than using the state, because I'm thinking you'll want to be able to call that from your script. So for example, we could have an asynchronous loaded slides. So maybe you say load slides dot then take your slides, inject into the DOM or whatever, but then you could call sliders dot set slider width, but then you could pass your slider element to it. You would probably want to be able to call this set slider width from your own script because it needs to be called every time the number of slides is going to change. So rather than having it rely on state, which we can't really do from outside the script, and I don't want people to have to do it. Let's actually add a parameter here so you can pass it the slider itself. So this will be a param HTML element slider container unordered list. Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be an unordered list, but we'll call it the slides container, or just the slider element, or whatever you want to call it. But anyway, now that you pass this, we won't have to use the state. So instead of using this.state, I'll just remove that, and we'll say slider.style.width and slider.child_element_count. And in that way, this will be easier to use from outside your method, because in this case, because we are having to kind of set the width based on a number of slides, it's probably going to be a method we want to expose to outside developers so they can update the width anytime something is changed for whatever reason. So that being said, let's go back up to init, and we'll just change this to, rather than saying load state, we'll set slider width with the slider element, like so. And it doesn't work because I don't know. Oh, you know what? I never added the attributes to the HTML. I'm surprised it worked. I guess it didn't need to because we didn't have any click listeners yet, other than the buttons, which we added attributes to those. So the reason this doesn't work is because this selector is not finding anything, because we have this attribute for data slider, which I actually need to add to right here, data-slider. So on our unordered list, we add data-slider, and you'll see now it updated that on initialization. So you'll see it actually sets width 300%. And if for some reason, if we were to like asynchronously add stuff, so let me just show you. Let me just copy this HTML. What we'll do is we'll just pretend like async pretend. We will first of all set const slider equals document.query selector data slider. So we'll just get a reference to that. I'm just like messing around with this. You guys don't need to do this. I'm just trying to demonstrate something. Maybe I'll demonstrate it well, maybe I won't. We'll see. Totally unplanned. So let's try this out. We have a reference to the slider element, and we'll take slider dot, oh, you know what I want to do? I want to say const slide equals document.create element. And then you give it a tag name, which is going to be a list item. And then we'll say slide.inner HTML equals, and then we'll need to give it a class as well, slide.classList.add slide, because it has this li class equals slide. And then we'll set the inner HTML equal to this HTML, which we can tab over here. And I guess we'll add the same strawberry slide at the end, but I'll put new slide in there so you can tell that it's new. So basically what we're going to do is programmatically, we're going to create this list item, and then we're going to say slider dot append. What is it? Append child. That's what it is. Append child slide. And you'll notice when I do that, it's going to mess up our style, right? Because we programmatically, you could pretend that this could be like asynchronously loading the content. We programmatically kind of are pretending that we're asynchronously loading slides. So basically, when we initialized our slide up here, it had 3 slides, but then we added a new slide to it, which you can see over here. Now everything's messed up, right? There's our new slide that we programmatically added, but now everything's messed up because in our state, every time we click, it thinks that it has 4 slides, but its width is set to 300% still, right? So we need to be able to say sliders dot set slider width slider. So I need to be able to do that every time the number of children change. So you'll see by adding this, when I save, it's going to fix it, right? Because now we have 4 slides, but it's set the width to 400%. So everything's going to look great. So that's kind of something that is typical when you build web interaction components. You may have some sort of method that is exposed publicly and needs to be called whenever something occurs. So like when you do DOM injection, like we're doing here, or when you change content or whatever. That's pretty typical of a lot of web interaction components, is that you kind of instruct other developers to kind of say, hey, call this method when your content changes, to reinitialize or to do something. And so in this case, we can do that using this set slider width, which I think it's going to work better in this case. We don't actually need to do this. That was just, like I said, just kind of following my stream of consciousness and just playing around with this a little bit to try to make it work, make it good. But I think that's going to work really well. And now we have created some pretty cool functionality. We have created a dynamic width on our slides container, which is great. We added some styles to our left and our right, or previous and next rather, buttons that we have added to this. And I think it's all working very well at this point. Cool. So I think that's going to do it for this lesson. We will check out some more ways to improve this. And in particular, we will consider the touchscreen experience for our slider in the next lesson. We'll start to add some new stuff to it to introduce this idea of swiping, because that is a common way you may want users to interact with this type of pattern, where you have a panable sort of way that you can swipe through some content. So we're going to introduce that idea and introduce some new stuff in the next lesson, which can be very exciting. So stay tuned for that. We'll check that out in just a moment.